Alright guys, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about the 5 levels of combat encounter building. That's sort of what we're doing. So welcome back, or if this is your first time, welcome here. So I had a couple of videos sort of pop up in my primarily YouTube but also social media feed about encounter design, and I wanted to kind of, it seems like there's some people talking about it, so I figured it'd be a good topic to sort of jump in for this stream. So that's what we're going to do today. Most of the stuff that I kind of looked at, because I kind of pick and choose and kind of looked at, kind of skimmed through some of that stuff, watched some of them, and kind of took a look at some blogs and some other things that are kind of, at least more recently, kind of what the kind of zeitgeist is kind of talking around it. And what I found is most of it's sort of really applicable to what we're going to call action-based TTRPGs. So D&D 5e, or D&D in general, really. But really, any of the tips that we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the sort of like 5 levels of combat encounter building. And that's going to cover basically anything from really OSR all the way up to even sort of new things that are kind of coming out with like Daggerheart and things like that. So, and MCDM's new stuff that's going to be coming out. So really everything's going to be applicable to regardless of what system you're running, as long as you're running kind of an action-based RPG system, which we kind of separate slightly differently from something that like maybe like Vaesen or Call of Cthulhu or Traveler or something like that, that aren't as sort of action slash combat focused, right? Those are a little bit different. But if you're playing in a very sort of action focused game, like all of these tips are going to be super helpful for you and help you sort of run better combat encounters and sort of more meaty combat encounters. So let's go ahead and jump in. I will pull up the screen so you guys can look at exactly the same thing that I'm looking at. So here we go. Up. Nope, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for this one. There we go. Other one's just my notes, so you don't need to look at those because we're going to write them out here for you to see while we go through them, so you don't skip ahead. That's all we're looking at. So first thing we kind of look at is sort of the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, the how for this video, and sort of like who these tips are kind of geared towards. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in the chat and interrupt me, and I will try to address them as possible. But yeah, that's the sort of things we're going to go through. I'm not going to probably bring in a lot of VTT stuff. I kind of poked around in a few different ones. This would have been a really super easy one to bring in, something like the 1.0 Owlbear Rodeo, which I would have really liked to pull in because it's a very easy one that you don't have to do a lot of sort of background setup for. Kind of illustrate these points, but what are you going to do? They have shifted and moved towards 2.0, which is, in my opinion, very closely kind of put them in the same arena as Rodeo Arena, as every other sort of VTT, which is these very sort of cumbersome sort of beasts. Hey, how you doing? Nice to see you. So we're gonna jump in and kind of talk about that. So I was looking at sort of an option to sort of illustrate some of those things, but I kind of ran out of time for looking at, I think, table plop, I think, was the one that I was kind of looking at, but I didn't have enough time to sort of feel comfortable to be able to kind of show those things on the fly. So sorry, I wanted to, but I kind of ran out of time. So let's kind of jump right in. So what is this kind of geared towards? So the who. So maybe if you're watching the video, maybe you're new to the hobby, or maybe you've run the starter set, or maybe the essentials line for D&D 5e, because that's going to be kind of what we're going to focus on, because it's kind of the one that, in general, the audience is going to have the most knowledge about. So it's, for illustrated purposes, that's the one we're going to use. So maybe you've run the starter set, or some other sort of prepackaged adventure, whether that's Mines of Phandelver, or what is it? Icespire, right? That's the essentials one. Something like that. So maybe you've done that, and maybe you're trying to move out of, or some other sort of prepackaged, pre-published adventure, and trying to sort of move out into more of a homebrew sort of thing. So that's really interesting. So that's sort of who we're looking for. We're looking at mostly new DMs, or new to at least sort of the homebrew aspect, or new DMs that kind of reach in and kind of have those sort of like oh crap moments sort of around their first sort of like homebrew adventures or encounters, where, you know, things don't really go quite how you want them to, and they're kind of head scratchers. Like, I don't really understand. Like, I feel like I'm balancing the encounters, but I don't feel like that's being reflected. What I prep is not being reflected in the play, right? Right, there's some sort of dissonance between those, and you're trying to figure that out. So this is going to kind of help to reach that sort of aspect. So we talked about the who, so now the what. That's kind of what. So we're looking for people that you're trying to hit this sort of middle zone, right? You don't want TPKs, right? We're trying to avoid those in general, but also we're not trying to do these sort of combats where a lot of new DMs kind of struggle, where the PCs just sort of steamroll over every single encounter. So something in between these two, right? We kind of want to shoot that middle lane, which is basically, we want an encounter that is difficult and kind of makes the players have to think a little bit about the encounter, but not so much that there's a very high chance that it's going to just straight up wipe them. But also, there's also a lesser chance that they're just going to steamroll over it. So we're kind of trying to figure out what that middle area is and kind of lock that in, right? And then give us some dials, some tools to be able to sort of adjust up and down when we want to make more difficult encounters and when we kind of want to make easier encounters, right? That's kind of what we're looking for. And so when do you want to use this? Well, pretty much anytime you prep, right? Ideally, you're going to be prepping combat encounters specifically. In this case, so of course, if you've watched other videos or done other streams with me or watched the solo RPG stuff that I do a lot of random encounters, and those things aren't prepped encounters, so they're a lot more noodly and wishy-washy about sort of difficulty and things like that. So, but these are going to be in ideas sort of like adventures or dungeons that kind of prep beforehand, and these are sort of relatively static encounters for the most part. And not sort of things that you're kind of pulling out of your butt on the fly. So that's sort of what we're looking at. And where, well, encounters can happen kind of everywhere, but primarily we're going to look at sort of in-person tables. And we'll talk about sort of like the VTT and sort of those sort of issues with that. One of the things that I'm not really focusing on sort of the VTT aspect, other than, I mean, obviously if you've watched the solo RPG streams, I don't use a lot of VTT stuff. And that's, as I was explaining to some viewers, that one of the reasons I don't do that is because the high randomness encounter of it, and VTTs are very sort of built on making sure that you have the tokens and making sure that you have sort of the appropriate maps, and those don't really brook well with encounters that you have to pull out of your butt all the time, right? Unless you're going to do a lot of prep work beforehand to have, you know, a literal army of tokens that you can pull from, and a literal army of different scenes that you can pull from to keep the maps always looking fresh and stuff like that. So I'm not as focused on that. And also, I think from the VTT specific aspect, so I played in a game with one of my friends yesterday, and I'm going to use a lot of those points because it was a combat encounter that they weren't particularly happy with the sort of end result of. It wasn't really, really bad. Like, we didn't really steamroll it or anything, but it was something that they wanted it to be a little bit more difficult, and they weren't really happy with that transition from prep to play, right? What they had built in their mind didn't really show up at the table. And so we're going to look at that, and I felt like it's going to be a really good salient point. And one of the first things that kind of showed up is that they built a very, very in-depth VTT map for it. And this is an in-person game, and sometimes we cast things to like a television or something like that so everybody can kind of see the map. We ended up having some technical difficulties, and that's one of the things that I really want to kind of focus on right off the bat, is that the map aspect, the sort of visual aspect of D&D, is its own thing. And I think, especially modern, like right now, like people really, really focus on like the Chepeku maps and things like that, and sort of bringing those things and, paying money for like Foundry or another, or the premium Roll20, those sorts of packages. Then, and don't get me wrong, when they work, they look great, and those encounters look great. But what I find out is that a lot of DMs, especially newer DMs, can unfortunately focus more on the setup, like the map aspect and the token aspect of it, and they spend more time prepping that than they prep the actual encounter, which is the interactive portion. And then they're like, oh, well, I spent all this time on this really nice map, which is just like what my friend DM did yesterday, spent all this time on this map, and then it ends up not being useful, or it ends up not really mattering to the encounter in general. So that's one of the things we want to avoid. So we're not going to be talking about specifically map illustrative based things, which again, one of the reasons why I'm not sort of bringing up the VTT aspect is because that's not super important. So the why. So why are we going to do this? Well, we kind of talked about it. A lot of these like WH questions kind of fold into each other. They very much mesh. That idea that we're trying to shoot that middle ground between something that's an absolute steamroll and something that's, an absolute slog or TPK. Basically, there are sort of like, when you're talking about uninformed combats, there are basically three ways that those sort of bad combats kind of go. Either it's the party sails straight through it, right? It's an absolute cakewalk, and they just mow down everything in their path, and it's not a challenge, and they don't really use a lot of resources, and they just rip right through it. And they were like, and from a DM's perspective, right, you can kind of feel like, oh, well, that was kind of a waste of time, I guess, in the end, right? So we want to avoid that. And we want to avoid, obviously, the polar opposite of that, which is that I had sort of like a middle encounter in an adventure that the monsters beat the literal snot out of the adventurers, right? They take the PCs out behind the shed and they just beat the absolute crap out of them. And so we don't want that, because then that makes we have a hard encounter, but we were expecting to have like an easy to medium encounter, and now we're like, oh, but there's more hard encounters coming up in the adventure, and there's a boss encounter, and are they going to be able to do that? So do I give them a long rest in the middle of a dungeon? We don't really want to do that generally. So, and you're trying to have all these gears spinning in the background as you're trying to sort of on the meta level try to figure out the balancing for the adventure as you're going along. Right, as DMs, we know there's already enough stuff to juggle, so we kind of really want to hone in on that middle ground, so when we build an encounter, we have a better idea of kind of what's going to happen when it gets to the table, right? Dice rolls are a big part of the game, and the D20 is equally weighted between natural 1s and natural 20s, so there's only so much we can do. Sometimes the dice are on your side, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're on the player's side, sometimes they're not. So, but the idea is that we control the things that are hard numbers, the things that we can kind of tangibly mix up, and luck's going to be what luck's going to be, but kind of focus in on that. And then that's sort of like the third thing that kind of happens is kind of the middle ground, right? So we dial things in, and it feels sort of correct, but then it just ends up being a slog, right? The PCs and the monsters rush at each other like, the still from like Marvel Endgame, right, where you have the two sides just run into each other, right? Iconic sort of scene setup for, or shot setup for basically any big action movie, right? You have the two armies, whatever, slam into each other, and then they just kind of stand there and swap hits until, for 4+ uninteresting rounds, until enough of one side fall down and don't get back up. And that's not particularly interesting, right? I think we all have that experience as a DM where we sit there and go like, okay, it's like round 4. It's clear that the PCs are going to win, but there's still like four bad guys on the on the field, and we're just like whittling down HP at this point. So that's not really what we want to do, right? We want to focus in on creating combat encounters that they don't steamroll over, that don't steamroll over them, and don't turn into sort of this uninteresting slog, right? That ends up taking a bunch of session time, even when it's clear like what the end result's going to be. So, I think any new DM or any DM in general kind of gets to that point and they're like, well, there's got to be some better way, right? Like, am I doing something wrong? Like, what's the deal? And so, as I was thinking about this topic and kind of brainstorming things, bringing things up, I jumped into sort of the 5e DMG to see, like, all right, well, let me go back. Again, 5e DMG is not a book that I use very often. I don't think a lot of experienced DMs use very often, especially for 5e. It's not a super good resource for us, right? But jump in and see, like, what does they say? All right, well, they have about 2.5 pages on the subject, which is, for a game whose rules are like 60% combat, having only 2.5 pages on how to build combat encounters seems really not enough, right? That's not enough. 60% of your rules, but it's like 1% of the DMG, right? Is it a book? It's a book. I don't know. I've never heard of this book. Good. There are better books to look at. Again, if you're looking for, if you're specifically a new DM, I would point you towards something like Sly Flourishes, Lazy DM, Return of the Lazy DM. I think that's a much better sort of practical book for teaching you how to sort of run sessions and run adventures and do that sort of stuff. Or actually, what I'd point you towards from a rules perspective is something like at least the first edition, because I don't think I've read the second edition of Paizo's Pathfinder First Edition Game Mastery Guide. Both of those books have a lot of stuff into it, and if you don't have the Game Mastery Guide or whatever, even though you can get the Pocket Edition, which is really relatively inexpensive, I think it's like $20, you can pick it up pretty easily in most retailers. Or I would actually, one of my favorite DMG books is actually the 4th edition DMG. Primarily one, but a lot of people like 2, because there's actually 2 DMGs for 4th edition. But that 1st edition DMG, because it's got a lot of super good practical advice, even though, right, you can't use the numbers in it because the system's different. But the ideas, the underlying concepts of it, and sort of like the expertise that comes with it to kind of tell you about, like, how to play games, no player archetypes, how to set up, fulfilling things, and how to do adventures, and how to set up those things, and how much to do with this, and how much to do with that. Like, that book's really, really good at that. It's really built as sort of a practical guide, what would you call that? Some sort of dungeon master guide, I guess you would call it a dungeon master guide. But a dungeon master guide that kind of focuses on guiding dungeon masters, right? Especially sort of teaching new dungeon masters who aren't coming in with years and years of experience how to do that, right? A DMG kind of jump in to do that. So that's sort of what we're looking at, right? So there's got to be some better way, right? And so the 5e DMG has 2.5 pages of combat encounter building sort of information of it, and then if we extrapolate, if we just pull out completely the XP math info, right, which is about how to build the numbers of encounter building, if we pulled that out, which is kind of dubious advice at best because, well, we'll get into the CR system, but kind of pull that out, it is what, like half a page of useful info? It's basically nothing in 5e. And so it's not your fault. It's not anybody's fault that somebody looks at that and is like, I don't understand how to create good encounters. Well, it doesn't seem like back in 2014, WotC knew either, or at least couldn't write it down in the book how to do it, which makes sense. I mean, if you go back and there are a lot of really early on 5e interviews with the design team and sort of articles and things like that, kind of talking about sort of like the designers and developers behind 5e and how because of course they all run their own home games, right? Talking about like how they're using the new edition, and it's written down, right? They are very explicit in that they do not use the CR system. They do not use the system they built for the game that they're trying to promote, right? That they're playing. They don't use the system because they know the system doesn't work. But when you're a very, very experienced DM, right, you have enough sort of sort of system knowledge, right? You have this big egghead that you can kind of draw on from experience and knowledge of the system to be like, okay, but I kind of understand what to do, but apparently not to the extent that they could actually translate that internal knowledge to external knowledge in a book. Or maybe there were time constraints or something, or maybe the people who were writing it were not the developers, which also happens sometimes, so it's not your fault, but the 5e and DMG is not going to help you. But of course, if you guys are interested in sort of the 5e DMG, and one of the things that I thought about sort of before the new books come out, it's kind of the revisions come out, is to take a look kind of chapter by chapter through the DMG and kind of fixing it along the way. So if you guys are interested in that sort of content, make sure you leave sort of like a comment and let me know, because that would be a very interesting thing, I think, and potentially really useful things, especially for newer DMs, regardless of system, to kind of go through a bad example of a Dungeon Master's Guide and kind of chapter by chapter go like, this is bad, this is what I would do instead, or this is better advice, or this resource would be better for that, kind of give you a better set. So if you guys are interested in information like that, make sure you leave a comment on the video, and then that way I'll see that there's enough interest in it and I can do some of that stuff. Or I'll do something else. Whatever. So let's go ahead and jump into the first level. I guess how, like, this is going to be the how aspect, right? The how aspect is our levels that we're going to look at. So the first level we're kind of looking at is that apprentice level combat encounter building. So we're kind of understanding that you're coming from the background of a DM who has probably run some pre-published stuff, or the Essentials Kit, or the Starter Set, right? You've run these sorts of things, so you have an idea of sort of like the basic mechanics of the game and how that stuff, but you're kind of struggling to build your own encounters, and maybe you're trying to mirror things from the books, but maybe it's not kind of coming in exactly the same as you expect it to, or maybe it's not. And whether the books do or do not also hit the points that we're kind of looking at, but you're trying to replicate what's already published, primarily by people who are considered to be, you know, experts in the field, kind of telling you what to do, and you're trying from context, trying to replicate that in your own game, and you're kind of struggling with it. So the first thing that you're going to run across, I think, as any apprentice DM does, is you're going to run across, and we'll just put it down here, right here. The first thing that, if you, right, the immediate time that you do any sort of like first time like Google search or online search about like encounter building, the first thing you're going to come across is, right, CR. You come across Adventure Tiers, and you're going to come across Action Economy. So, and this is kind of the stumbling block, I think, for a lot of the new DMs. Again, the DMG is not very good about talking about it, and so you kind of have to intuit this, or speak to somebody else who has expertise that kind of breaks it down for you, which is why I'm making the video, right, while we're doing the stream. Kind of talk about these. So CR, challenge rating, right? The thing we come across first is that players have levels, monsters have challenge ratings. And those things are not equal, and they're not the same, and monsters don't play by the same rules that PCs do, which is a real stumbling block for people. I find that a lot of people that come from sort of the 3rd edition 3.5 Pathfinder area of the hobby, is that you'll often come across sort of like Dungeon Masters, Game Masters that build monsters as player characters. And like, these things are not equal, and they shouldn't be equal. And if you've ever watched a DM try to do that and try to manage that, you see that like running a player character is like a full role, right? We're players. When you're a player, you're like, this is an entire thing that I do, and it's like multiple sheets of information. God forbid you choose a spellcaster as a bad guy, right? Now you have all the spells to do with, and that's one of the big gripes with 5e, is that, right, anytime you play a necromancer, which was in the combat that my DM ran yesterday, had a necromancer as sort of one of the sort of cornerstone of the encounter, and they were really frustrated because they felt like the necromancer they couldn't get off a lot of great spells, and they're a spellcaster, so they have really crappy hit points, and they have really crappy AC and saves, so, right, we kind of kick their teeth in. Not in a steamroll way, but, like, I mean, melee characters got up on them and do what melee characters do, which is kind of beat the snot out of them. And when they have such a low AC and not great saves, that's relatively easy to do. So that's sort of the first thing we kind of run into, right? Is that CR is like a crude estimation of encounter building, which is why it's not super useful for 5e, and that's why the designers don't use it, right? Is that it's at best a very, very rough estimation, and it doesn't work particularly well. So it's not really helpful in a very sort of nuts and bolts kind of way. It's sort of it's a good place to start, but it's by no means the end all be all, which is kind of what 5e, especially the DMG, kind of sells it as. And right, it just isn't. So on top of that, we have basically adventure tiers. So right, we have bands of sort of adventure for basically PC player character power levels, right? We have levels 1 through 4, 5 through 10, 11 through 16, and 17 through 20. And these basically correspond to like bands of types of adventures, right? You have your super local ones, which is 1 through 4, then you're sort of like regional, kind of getting some notoriety, that's sort of 5 through 10, and then you get through 11 through 16, which is like you're pretty well known, right? You're people in different nations and know who you are, right? You're dealing with issues of, to put it in practical terms, national security kind of issues, and then sort of 17 through 20 you're doing like, that's big save the world kind of stuff, right? That's the big things you're doing. Well, I mean, you start that probably in tier 3, kind of doing planes hopping, but 17 plus in the levels, you're looking at like saving entire planes of existence, or jumping between planes is a very chasing bad guys who can do similar things, and right, there's very sort of apocalyptic world ending kind of stuff. So if you know that, if you know those sorts of bands, it makes it much easier when you're looking at monsters to be like, are goblins a threat to national security? Probably not. I mean, they could be. I mean, if you're playing in something like the anime Dungeon Slayer world, like unmitigated, right? If you don't do anything about them, then yes, right? But they have their own evolution into like other monsters, right? That's sort of like the backbone of that sort of ecology of goblins. But in general, right? Goblins, kobolds, not probably a huge threat, apocalyptic threat to ending the world, right? Those are very much like, oh, well, you know, goblins raid our village every once in a while, right? That sort of thing. But if you have something that's like we had like the necromancer, not a particularly powerful one, but definitely like a necromancer is definitely not beyond like local village kind of style threat, right? This is more of a sort of like, oh, there's a necromancer and they can like summon an army of undead. It might not be a gigantic like World War sort of army, but they can summon an army of undead, and they have some pretty nasty spells, so that pretty much puts them in that sort of adventure tier 2 or 3, kind of depending on what level of sort of spellcaster they are, right? That's where the sort of CR kind of helps. If you're like, okay, well, they're like a CR7, and like, well, CR7 might even be too low. Let's say a CR9. Well, yeah, that's going to probably put them... The CR is supposed to be a rough approximation of this character. A CR9 is supposed to be a threat for a 9th level party, which is not true. But is more of a threat for something that's probably closer to like a 6th level party, or in our case, a 5th level party, who kind of kick their teeth in, right? Relatively easily. So it does have that sort of kind of going for it. So if you think about the adventure tiers, and then you kind of pull in the CR to kind of get a little bit finer tuning on it, you can kind of have a better idea. And then of course we have to talk about action economy, which is really where most DMs kind of stop. Specifically in 5e, that's sort of where I feel like a lot of DMs who get to homebrew get to that point, and then just kind of don't keep progressing, right? We get to the idea of action economy, which is, especially in a very flat math system, which is 5e, where the numbers are there's a very small range between the very low levels of average sort of d20 rolls and the high level of d20 rolls, which 5e has. And you can compare that to something like Pathfinder. So to look at something, my example from yesterday's game that I played in, my character rolled a 30 history check. They're an intelligence-based character. They had the help action. They had guidance. They're very good at intelligence checks, and they're trained in history. So, you know, that's not... It's still high, but it's not... It's towards the top end of what they can roll. You look at something like Pathfinder, where a DC 30 history check is something that probably any... It's been a little bit since I played Pathfinder, especially 1E. Probably something that any 5th level character, which is what we are, could hit pretty reasonably, right? Assuming that you get a +1 at each level, right? Because that's sort of how their skill points work. Your 5th level, your at a base is going to have a +5 plus your intelligence, which was maxed out for my character, so +10 plus some other stuff, which is already more pluses than I got for the character at 5e. So those numbers, like the range of numbers, is much larger. But in a flat math system, action economy matters a lot more. And the easiest way to sort of like kind of talk about that is that most monsters in 5e have an AC that kind of hovers between 13 and 17. So PCs are going to hit them pretty regularly, and as you get higher and higher and higher, you get some small bonuses, right, from your proficiency or from abilities score increases to... You're going to have some bonuses, but you're not going to ever have probably a range where you roll like a 2 and you're going to hit most monsters, right? But that's different from something like Pathfinder, where if you're fighting a super low level monster and you're a higher level character, you can absolutely roll a 2 and still hit a low level creature. Like, it's because the math scale is very different. But because the math's so flat, the action economy, what you can do in a turn, matters a lot more. And so the people who have more attacks, have more actions in a combat, are almost always going to defeat the other side, whether that's monsters or PCs, that have less actions. Because it represents their ability to, you know, basically do more, put more damage on the field. And so that's really important in the action economy. And how that sort of plays out in 5e is that it's very easy to make an encounter where you don't, where you can just put a whole bunch of monsters on the field. That's really easy. So when I did a little bit of math, just kind of look at it, what it was going to be. So I kind of want to talk. Really, what do you want to look at? Well, let me get there. So by the math, let's say if you wanted to do a 5th level party, right? Kind of. It's important because of the adventure tiers, because at 5th level, your attack damage output basically doubles, right? Most melee characters get 2 attacks once they hit 5th level, and cantrips double in damage once they hit 5th level. So that jump between 4th and 5th level is really, really important. Between 4th and 5th level is extremely important, which is why when you're building encounters, you actually typically don't want to use monsters that are outside that adventure tier, because they're built for a different style of PC. So if you're running for 4th level adventurers and you pull in some really meaty bad guys from, you know, that are like CR6, 5 or 6 or something like that, they're not balanced for that party. They're meant to attack people that have 2 attacks, that do double damage with cantrips, do that. And so you can very easily have monsters just kind of kick the snot out of PCs, because they have that action economy on their side, even though you might actually have fewer monsters than the PCs. But because almost all of them are going to have multi-attack, or they're going to have spells that do a lot of damage, or abilities that do a lot of damage, they're gonna beat down on your party. So you kind of want to stay within that adventure tier. So the easiest way to do that is this bad guy right here, at least for 5e. It's Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and it's page, I think, 90. Yeah. 90 and 91, which is the pages you want to look at, which is the quick matchups and the multiple monsters matchups. And you'll notice, I mean, probably can't see it here, but these tables over here are actually specifically broken down by those adventure tiers. That's for a reason, right? To kind of tell you, and you kind of want to look at primarily one bad guy per one PC, right? Kind of zone in on that as sort of your base level for encounter building, and kind of stay there. Because it's very easy, like I said, with either a 4th or 5th level party. I think you can balance that sort of a 5th level party. You can balance a hard encounter, which is like 20 CR 1/4 axe beaks. And by the math, that is an appropriately balanced encounter. But now you're looking at an action economy of 20 versus 10. That's double the action economy, right? Because 5th level characters, again, they're going to get that double damage on cantrips, and they're going to get... Most characters are going to have 2 attacks if they don't have spells. And like the standouts like Rogue that don't get extra attack are going to be the characters that have their sneak attack goes up, so they're still going to do a lot of damage. But still, you're looking at a 2-to-1 ratio, which is even if you were at a position where they had super high ACs or super good saves, maybe they have really great stats for all the characters, and you're going to end up with one of those 3 basically uninteresting sort of combats that we talked about. You're either going to have one where the monsters are going to steamroll the party, right, because they have so many attacks on the action economy. The PCs are going to steamroll them because, you know, the wizard or whoever's going to have a couple of big AoE spells for, you know, CR 1/4 monsters that are just going to wipe the field really quickly. Or you're going to get into a slog, right? They have to take down 20 specifically different characters. You have to roll 20 specifically different attacks each round, right? It's a pain in the butt. So, right, that really sort of talks about what we're trying to avoid, right? very, 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 very quickly. But the quick matchups and multiple monster tables are going to give you a good idea very quickly, right? They knew that the CR, that the combat encounter stuff they put in the DMG was real dog, right? They knew it wasn't good. And so in Xanathar's Guide, you see a lot of sort of like... Xanathar's Guide, in a lot of ways, is kind of a book that is 5e errata, in a lot of ways, that kind of fixes a bunch of sort of the basic problems with 5e. So they're going to kind of jump in and do that. So yeah, that's sort of the very basics for apprentice level, and that's where I find a lot of people kind of stop in general. Right? They don't... most DMs don't go further than that. It's been my experience. They're like, okay, I got it. And so as far as the action economy, if you want to look for like kind of a quick tip, I kind of like to look for, when I'm building encounters, try to find a balance of monsters that are gonna, again, generally stay within that same adventure tier, right? We don't want to throw a 3rd level party up against monsters that are meant for a 5th level party plus, even if it's one monster, right? You end up had another somewhat similar situation where we had a red dragon kind of wipe a party, right? Because you had a party that was kind of butting up against that adventure tier level, right at the ceiling of where they were, and then pull in a solo monster from the next tier up, right? Those things are not balanced for the same thing. And then, right, the dragon does a whole bunch of damage, it has a whole bunch of attacks, and has layer actions and all this stuff, and just absolutely rip through a party in like a couple of turns, right? we want to avoid that. Right? That's not what we want to do. So that sort of action economy. So basically, I'm looking, when I'm building encounters, kind of look for something that's from a number of monsters that is more than half the party in general, but less than twice the party. So if, assuming you have a very standard fourth level or four member party, I kind of want to generally look for the build encounters that's has about 3 to 7 bad guys on the field, generally, right? I feel very comfortable enough and very experienced enough to those numbers are very wobbly to me. Like I'm like, I could probably do 10 of lower level monsters, and if I need them to run away or I need them to die quickly or whatever, I feel pretty confident about sort of adjudicating that on the roll. But at the same time, I very rarely run combats in which I'm going to have 2 or fewer monsters in it. And we see that very, very common in 5e. That's one of the laments that, and it's not a 5e specific thing, it's a very specific thing across basically all action-oriented RPGs, is that solo monsters just don't work very well, right? They don't, the practical aspects of play don't match the fantasy that we have for monster fights in our head with the big solo fights, right? They just don't, there's a disconnect. Those things are not the same, and it's really hard to sort of make them the same, right? We have the legendary resistances and legendary actions and layer actions and all that stuff to try to build that up, and I have my own gripes with that system, which I don't think are very good for 5e, but that was sort of 5e's band-aid way to be like, oh, well, yeah, you can totally run solo encounters. They just have all this other extra stuff that no other monsters get and players don't get, and only if they're in their home turf, so they have a home field advantage, and right, we're adding a lot of like additional things in there to try to make a solo encounter work, which they don't generally work very well. So I do want to kind of talk about, right before we move on to the next part, so one of the things that which was very interesting thing, so I kind of talked about like the 20 CR 1/4 axe beaks. So I watched a different video from a different DM kind of talking about their struggles with sort of encounter building, and one of the things that they talked about was having a 17th level party. This was the example they used, a 17th level party with 50 plus shadows, which I think are also CR 1/4. No, shadows are CR 1. And they're like, oh, well, you could have CR, 50 plus shadows. It's really important to read the stat block, which is true. But one of the things that makes shadows really, really dangerous, enemies especially for their CR, is that they do strength damage, right? That's a property of them. Is that they don't just do hit point damage, they actually suck strength from characters. And if you hit 0 in a stat in 5e, you die, right? So if you have 50 plus shadows in every attack, they can do a d4 of damage to your strength. Your wizard can easily go down in 3, 4 hits, right? And when you got 50 plus bad guys on the field, again, kind of a hyperbolic example, because I can't imagine a world in which you would really want to try to run 50 plus bad guys. Like, that would make your DM turn in combat just a slog, having to roll 50 plus d20s to try to figure out if you hit. Like, that would slow down the game so much. Like, again, it's a very hyperbolic example, but it does kind of talk about it. And they kind of showed like a very, very standard adventuring party, and a 17th level adventuring party that has, a fighter, has a wizard, has a rogue, and has a cleric in it. But doesn't really talk about what is actually going to make that encounter actually really, really easy. They kind of skipped over that part. They're like, oh, well, that's probably going to be a TPK. And I'm like, yeah, it would be if they didn't have a cleric in the party. But the problem is that a 17th level cleric's going to spend 2 rounds nuking all those shadows with Destroy Undead. And because their CR is so low, and they have a +0 to the wisdom save, and that, a 17th level cleric's probably got a DC 20 probably save? Like, they got to roll a natural 19 or 20, they have a 5% chance, right? So 95% of those shadows are gone in the first round. Probably, before they probably get to act, right? Because everybody else's probably initiative is going to be so much better. And so you're like, it's an unbalanced encounter, but probably not in the way I think the the person who was filming the video meant. Right? They were talking about how, they're gonna overrun the party, but I'm like, but like round one, that cleric's gonna just destroy that encounter because that's what clerics do. You have an undead monster with a really crappy wisdom save, and they're low level, and his turn undead's going to destroy them, and it's a big radiant thing. It goes around corners, right? They just have to be, they have to be able to either see or hear you, which means that you can destroy those shadows around the corner. So even if they're not in the room, if they're within that 30 feet range, right? Assuming that they're swarming the party, because that's probably how I would imagine that setup for that encounter going, is that they kind of swarm towards the party from like all areas. Is that that cleric's going to hold up their holy symbol and just destroy that entire encounter in an action. So yeah, mass monsters really suck as a DM. They don't do it. Again, this is one of those things that unfortunately 4th edition did really well, right? By having those sort of minion characters, where being able to, like, you can pull in a bunch of things and it makes those, and you can make those really cool scenes, just like I talked about with the clerics sort of destroying undead. But when they're minion monsters, you're like, yeah, but they had 1 hit point anyways. I don't care, and they don't really influence the encounter building budget from a math sort of aspect. So you get the really cool scene where the cleric gets to do the cool cleric thing, and then there's still an encounter that happens, right? They still feel like they're useful because they did a bunch of really cool AoE crowd control, or they got to have that cool moment where the cleric does the cleric thing, and yet everybody else still gets to do something, right? There's still going to be a fight that happens because you're going to have other things that are in that fight. And I had a very similar sort of thing happen in my 5e solo game, where I had that. I pulled that in. Right, again, I'm making random encounters on the fly, and I had a number of gazers kind of come in, and the gazers have the eye beams that push characters away, and so that pushes characters like 10 feet or something like that. And I had a number of them, and so the combat just kind of ended up being kind of a slog, because every time that my melee characters got close to the gazers, they just pushed them away. And I'm like... And because there were multiples of them, right, I had a mass of them. I think there was like 6 of them or something like that, right? Anytime that a melee character got close to them, they're like, push, 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 and they would just like basically undo all their movement for the turn. And I'm like, that's not great, right? And that's why I gotta read the stat blocks. And so the second thing I want to talk about is monster strategy. They nicknamed them punties for minions. Yeah, they're really fun. Minions are a super great concept. They're really fun. And if you want to run a 5e encounter, and we'll talk about that later, where you want the players to feel super powerful, those super low level characters are super low level bad guys, whether they're minions with 1 hit point or just basic kobolds or whatever that you're using as kobolds or reskinning to be something else. Having those sorts of monsters that, can give the players that sort of power fantasy of just sort of like cleaving through a tide of them using their cool abilities to just like rip through a horde of low-level monsters is really cool. And that can be a fun combat encounter, but it wouldn't be what I would call a balanced combat encounter, right? We're not balancing that combat encounter to hit what we're trying to do, which is between the cakewalk and between sort of like the overall TPK, right? That's definitely on the cakewalk side, which is fine. You can build an encounter to do that, but you're building an encounter specifically to do that. So in the second one, I kind of want to talk about monster strategy. So a lot of people, I think, especially new DMs, are sort of, that kind of came into the hobby, especially with 5th edition, are pretty familiar, or at least probably heard of Keith Ammon's popular blog or book series, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, which really sort of like popularized how to do some encounter building strategy for 5e, right? Have a monster strategy. But all that stuff is baked in. Like, all that stuff is available. There's nothing that Keith is doing in that you couldn't do for yourself. Which is a weird thing, which I think is why I think myself and some other veteran DMs, especially who have played across multiple editions, kind of head scratch and be like, well, yeah. I mean, obviously, you read the stat block, you look at what they can do, and that's how you run monsters. But again, the fifth edition DMG has 2.5 pages of advice on building combat encounters, and I don't think any of that is, hey, you should read the stat block and try to set up the monsters in a way to do that, to give them strategy to really highlight what they do very well and mitigate what they don't do very well. But yeah, essentially you want to read the stat blocks beforehand. So when you're doing the building, and if you're looking from the math perspective, I would definitely say use something like the D&D Beyond Combat Encounter Builder or Kobold Fight Club or something like that. Do something that's going to automate the math for you, because doing the math by hand, again, right, there's like a page and a half or 2 pages of basically math in the DMG, and that's most of what they tell you for combat encounter building. So taking away the hand part of that math and focusing instead on the actual aspect of like choosing specific monsters and doing other things, and not worrying about sort of like the fiddly moving numbers around aspect, because it will automate that for you. But essentially you want to look at the monster stat blocks while you're building it. Take a look at, like, what do they do well? What do they not do so well? Like, what are their saves like? What are their attack bonuses like? What sort of, like, specific abilities do they have? And that the monster's tactics should reflect them trying to put themselves in a position to win. So they should try to do the things they're really good at, and try to avoid not doing the things that they're, you know, not good at, right? I mean, it seems really basic to say it out loud, but that's because I've known it, and I've known it for a long time. But for new DMs, right, this could be a revelation. Might be a revelation. If you're revelated, let me know. Right? But the idea is that, you know, Keith Hammond just looked at the monsters in the book and just wrote it out, and then has a wildly successful blog and book series about it. But you can do that too. You have the exact same resources Keith did when writing all that stuff, right? And you have the exact same sources. You can do this. So, for instance, like a good example of this is like 5e bugbears. 5e bugbears have javelins. They have a bonus to stealth, and they have what is the monster equivalent of a rogue sneak attack. That gives you a good insight as to how they should probably play at the table. They should always be looking for opportunities to ambush the NPCs whenever they can. They should try to do it from a distance, right? They have the javelins, they can do it from a distance before. And so if I was looking at building a specifically bugbear encounter, when I look at it as being like, all right, I want to look them in a position where they can, if they have an opportunity that they know the PCs are coming, they're going to hide so they can get that stealth bonus. And then they're going to try to do their sneak attack at a distance. So they're going to pop up from behind some rocks in the dungeon or barrels or whatever. And they're going to throw their javelins and try to do that sneak attack damage to some people right off the bat. And then on their turn, they're going to move away. They're going to run deeper into the dungeon or the forest or wherever you're fighting them. They're not going to rush up to the player characters. They're going to pop up, try to do their sneak attack damage with the javelins, and then run away. And then they should run back to basically look for another place to look for. So when they're throwing the javelins, they're going to... Bugbears are smart. They're as smart as humans, right? So they're going to particularly look to try to attack squishy characters. They're going to look for... Like, you have a javelin in your hand. You're looking at 4 potential targets. You're going to choose the one that's not wearing armor, right? You're going to look at that wizard in the back row and be like, oh, well, that's the guy I'm going to throw my javelin at, because a robe's not going to stop this javelin. And so you do that, and then you hightail it out of there with your buds, right? You're going to run back and look for a new place where you can hide, right? And basically, when one or two things are going to happen. Either you're going to do a whole bunch of damage to the party, and the party's going to run away real quickly because they got ambushed, or they're going to try to rally and go toe to toe with you. So as the bugbears, you're like, all right, well, I don't want to go toe to toe with these guys. That guy's wearing plate armor. I don't want to fight him. He's got a big sword. He's got a big fuck off sword. I don't want to fight that guy, so I'm going to run away from him. So they jump up, they throw their javelins, they do their little sneak attack damage, and then they try to run away and try to hide again, hoping to kind of like kite the PCs. Hopefully, if the PCs rally, they'll chase them. And then you're kind of spreading out the party, separating the party a little bit. Maybe the wizard goes down, maybe the cleric goes down, or the rogue goes down. You know, those lightly armored people are kind of go down, and maybe somebody's going to have to stay back to sort of like pull them back up, like feed them a health potion or whatever, and chase them. And they're going to look for another place to hide and pop up again, this time with their morning stars. And then we'll have sort of like the regular kind of combat slog, kind of. But you should always be kind of looking for ways for them to kind of do the things that they do really well, right? Especially for intelligent monsters, right? They're smart, they know what they're doing. Let them do the things that they're supposed to be good at doing, right? That's sort of what we want to look at. Let's see. Do they have anything else about that specific example? Oh yeah. So this is also a good way to very practically kind of teach players the kind of game or the kind of situation that they're in by sort of like telegraphing this sort of stuff. So the idea is that if the bugbears pop up and throw some javelins, and even if they take down one character, they're probably not going to kill that character outright. But it is going to teach them, hey, if you try to do a frontal assault at this goblin stronghold, it's probably not a good idea, right? They're gonna be prepared for you, and they know you're here now, right? They tell you that they know they're here, and they're prepared to defend their lair or whatever it is, forest, whatever. That they're prepared to do it, and that they can get the drop on you. So you need to be very cautious about how you approach. So anytime that you can get the players to sort of like mix up the way that they're sort of like standard operating procedures for an encounter. So let's say you didn't do the ambush, right? You treated the bugbear encounter just like another encounter. You come around the corner, there's a room, it's got 4 bugbears in it. You look at them, they look at you. Camera tilt. Roll initiative. What happens? The fighter, whoever it is, runs up and engages. The rogue either shoots from the back or runs up and tries to get that sneak attack with the fighter friend. The cleric, if it's a war cleric, is going to run up to also get in the melee. If they're not, they're going to stand back and do that. And if you have a spellcaster, they're usually in the back as well. So those people are going to probably, it's like a dungeon room, they're going to move back into the hallway so they can not get swarmed by the 3 other bugbears or whatever. And you're going to have your fighter and at that point maybe rogue kind of hold things off, or that fighters can try to stand in the doorway and try to protect the rest of the party, because that's kind of what they're supposed to do in combat. That's kind of their role. So any way that you can knock them out of that sort of like standard operating procedure, kind of knock them on their heels and have them sort of scramble to sort of figure out like what to do in a combat situation, is always really, really good. It really kind of, even though it's, a bugbear encounter by the numbers is pretty straightforward to counter, right? There's not a lot going on with it. Being able to like put them on their heels and be like, oh, well, yeah, but they just popped up and just like immediately took down the wizard or whoever it is. And now you're like, all right, well, now the fighter's going to chase them down and they're going to run away. And now the fighter's over here with them. And then the rogue's trying to figure out, like, do I chase the fighter? Do I stay back here? Because these guys are really, really dangerous. I don't want to get caught and just, porcupined with a bunch of javelins as well. So maybe I'll stick back here. And the cleric's probably doing a heal spell or pouring a potion down that wizard's throat to try to get them back up, right? Now they're already not doing the things they're supposed to do. And maybe, depending on how you run the bugbears and sort of the setup, you might kite that fighter away, and maybe, right, they're really good at stealthing. So if you have them stealth around the fighter, and now they're in between the fighter and the rest of the party, and they can hop on those much more squishier characters, and then as the fighter, like, they hear the rest of their party being attacked, and they have to turn around and run back, and right, anytime that you can try to kick them out of their standard operating procedure of how they generally, because that's generally how players work, right? They figure out the things that they're really good at, and they do the things that they're really good at. And they do it again and again and again and again. And then, right, you have people that complain about their games being boring or stuff like that. It's like, well, yeah, because you do the same 3 things again and again and again. So trying to do a mix-up, try to get them scrambling, trying to do things that they normally wouldn't do, or look at the things that they do and try to be like, how do I interrupt that? How do I use the monster strategy to put them in a position where they can do all the cool stuff that they do and stop the player characters from doing the sort of very base level cool stuff that they do, right? Again, and this is all very optical, right? They see a fighter or a paladin in heavy armor, whether that's scale or half plate or full plate, and be like, all right, well, don't really want to fight that guy because he's got way more armor than me. But there's a dude over there with a book and a robe. And again, bugbears are intelligent monsters. They can be like, well, I know enough about adventurers. If they know what a bugbear is, you can assume that the bugbear knows what a wizard looks like. And be like, well, that guy's probably going to fireball me if I don't kill him. So I'm going to kill him. Right. Or the cleric, if they see the cleric pull somebody back up that they just, porcupined with a bunch of javelins, and see him, like, he or she do sort of like the healing magic, grab their holy symbol, healing magic, and kind of like stands back up, be like, all right, well, take that dude out, because until we take that person out, anytime that we knock somebody down, they're just going to get back up. But if we knock down the person who gets the other people back up, there's nobody to get that person back up, right? If they have relatively human intelligence, you can treat them as a relatively human intelligent monster, right? They should adapt and do those sorts of things. So yeah, that's sort of the second level. And third level, what? The third level I kind of want to talk about for the apprentice level is non-death resolutions. And this really very quickly tells me how experienced the DM is. Is there any sort of resolution to combat that's not one side completely dies? Because there should be, right? If you look at the history of basically any conflict, from very basic, like, two people getting into a fight, all the way up to armies, massive armies fighting each other, there's very few circumstances in which one side completely eradicates the other side, right? There's always something else that happens. And so you should try to look at building that into your combat encounters as well, to sort of facilitate that same sort of thing, right? And that's really going to help with that sort of, what we talked about, that sort of middle part that's kind of the slog, where we kind of stretch combat out. Is that we want to shrink combats. We want combats to be punchy and fast and deadly and really exciting, right? A lot of sort of like, I don't know what's going to happen, right? I'm not sure if we're going to win this fight. But as soon as, like, players get to the point where they're like, we're definitely going to win this fight, then the combat's not as interesting, right? The energy level for combat drops very quickly. And it's been my experience that, especially in 5e, like, most combat encounters should last about 3 rounds. Right, so that's kind of what we're shooting for, is 3 good rounds of combat. That's enough time for each PC to be able to do something cool most of the time. It's going to be enough time to make it clear which side has the big momentum, like who's going to win in the fight most of the time. And it's going to stop you, like, you don't really want to force 5+ rounds of combat, because, first of all, it takes a bunch of table time for your session, right? Nobody likes playing a session and be like, well, we got one fight done, and that was it. Right, that doesn't feel, I think, from DM's perspective and from a player's perspective, like a good session of play, right? If you play for 3-4 hours and you guys get through like one real slog of combat that takes an hour to an hour and a half of the table time, and you're like, or even more, right? If you're running those 50+, if you're running 50+ shadows and you don't have or even the 20 axe speaks, and you don't have that cleric in the party who's just going to destroy the undead, and it turns into that slog, and you're like, oh, it's like 7 rounds of combat, but it's very clear we're going to win this fight, and we're just chipping away at bad guys' HP. If that's the case, then don't do it, right? This is where I look at sort of like the lost old school OSR secret to improving modern tabletop RPG combat, which is morale, right? Morale, very, very integral part of OSR stuff and monsters, right? You have morales. Monsters make morale checks. In especially in 5th edition, there is technically kind of some optional stuff about morale, but most people don't use it. The idea is that, right, every bad guy kind of, you can fall into a habit where every bad guy kind of fights to 0 HP, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense for the game that you're probably trying to run. It doesn't make a lot of sense from the monster's perspective. Like, in universe, right? Like, the in-game narrative, right? Being like, oh, well, there's a goblin, and this goblin's watched you kill, 7 of their best friends, and they're like, well, I'm gonna fight these 4 very powerful creatures all by myself. Then I guess, like, why would they do that? Why would it? I mean, goblins aren't the smartest creatures in the world, but they certainly understand that situation, right? Every animal kind of understands that situation, right? That should be there should be a moment where you're playing monsters where they have the fight flight mentality swap, right? For most monsters. Now, constructs and undead, zealots can do this too. So constructs and undeads, they're unthinking. If bad guys show up that they fight, right, they fight them. Zealots have some sort of greater purpose that keeps them in the fight. Even their life is not the most important thing to them, right? That's sort of the key thing. But for most monsters, they should run most of the time or do something else. So the way that I usually kind of run morale, and if you watch the solo RPG stuff, you'll notice this too, is that about 50 once a monster hits about 50% HP, I start having them make morale checks every turn. Or their group size is reduced by 50%. So again, if we're rolling in that sort of like 3 to 7 range, if 3 of their buddies have died, if there's 7 of them and 3 or 4 of their buddies have died, they're going to start making morale checks, even if they haven't had any damage. They're like, oh man, I just watched, these guys are really wiping out my friends. Maybe I should get out of here, right? I don't think we're going to win this fight. Anytime it starts to become clear that, like, they're not on the winning side, right, that momentum shifts against them, then they're like, oh, do they want to stay in this fight or not? And they could flee, they could run away, or they could surrender, or they could look for a way to transition the scene. Which is a very easy way to... The great thing about sort of like morale and having monsters move in a different way that's not just attack on the turns is it makes it a very fluid transition between combat encounters and a different type of encounter. So let's say you're in a dungeon. Let's just use the previous example. Let's use... I don't want to use yesterday's example because it has a bunch of undead in it because it's a necromancer fight, so it's not a great example for this. But let's use the bugbear example. So you have the bugbears that are fighting, right? 2 of the bugbears have gone down. There's 4 of them. 2 of them have gone down. And the other 2 are kind of looking at each other and like, I think we should get out of here, man. And so they run, right? They're in the dungeon. We kind of talked that this is sort of the beginning of a goblin stronghold. And then they're going to turn tail and run. We'll do a couple different circumstances. So this is one option. They turn tail and run. And your players might go, all right, great, we won the encounter. Let's go check on that wizard that they downed earlier. Let's go back and check on that. Or they might go, ooh, those guys are running deeper into a stronghold. They're going to alert the entire stronghold we're here. That makes things really bad. We should probably chase them, right? We're transitioning from a combat encounter to sort of an exploration chase encounter, right? Which is something totally different, right? So now they're trying to chase bugbears through this, let's say, like it's a goblin lair, so let's say like a cave system. So this warren of cave passages, and they're trying to track them and chase them down and listen to them, right? They're trying to listen to them and follow tracks and try to catch up to them as quickly as possible before they reach some sort of, whether that's like an alarm bell or another group of enemies that, right, kind of transition into another fight. And last thing you want is this fighter and rogue to run up into a totally different encounter on their own, right? You want to avoid that, so you want to stop them before they get there or get the heck out of there. So that's one way. So they could run. Another thing they could do is they could surrender. Right, if they're backed into a wall and there's no way out, they could try to get around the party, and if they have enough hit points to be like, well, I can take probably the attacks of opportunity to get past, they'll probably try to run. If they can't, they might just surrender, right? And then you have a totally different situation in which the players are going to have probably a social thing where they talk about, all right, well, you need to give us the layout of stuff, and, you know, how many goblins are there in this place, and blah, 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 blah. And then you have two bugbears that you're probably going to tie up and be like, all right, well, what the heck do we do with these two bugbears? Do we take them with us? Do we leave them here? Because, I mean, if we leave them here, eventually they're probably going to get out of these ropes, right? Based on the way that tying up characters works, especially in 5e, is that at some point they're gonna roll high enough to get out of the ropes. It may take them a while, but if you assume combat standard encounter, this is where like the time stuff of D&D kind of breaks down, where every 6 seconds they get an opportunity to try to break out of their bonds, right, and get free. They're gonna get free. At some point they're gonna roll a natural 20 and get free, right? Even if they have really, really garbage bonuses to basically what is, I think, technically, it's either a dex save or acrobatics. One of those two. For getting out of binds. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's one of those two. The old escape artist skill, basically. Like, they're gonna get out, so you're like, do we kill them? But also, like, is that gonna do... Like, what are the moral implications from the paladin if you have the paladin in the party who's like, yeah, I'm not really just gonna, like, execute these bound people. Maybe, maybe not, right? It becomes a social scene, right? It becomes a totally different type of scene, and it transitions very naturally. So that's option 2. So they can run, or they can surrender. The third thing they can do is try to parlay, right? They can open up lines of communication. They can turn it into a social scene themselves, right? You don't have to wait for the players to do that. You can just do that as the monsters. Maybe they speak broken common, and they can be like, please stop. Please, like, let us go. We're just gonna get out of here. You don't have to worry about us. We're gonna walk on, right? Or maybe what they do is maybe it's at the very beginning of the combat, they hop up, they down that wizard, and they try to intimidate the party and be like, drop your weapons and we'll let you go, right? Drop all your gear and we'll let you walk out of here with your lives. Or they'll try to rance them, and this works both ways. Like, if you have a combat encounter in which the momentum's on the bad guy's side, maybe they jump up and with their javelins they down the wizard. Maybe they get a lucky crit, and maybe they take down the rogue and the wizard in round 1 because they get a couple good shots, a couple good rolls on either crits or damage rolls, and it's a low level party, and they just immediately take them out of the fight. You can have them push that momentum instead of running that into a TPK. You can be like, okay, surrender now, and we'll let you leave with your lives, but we're going to take all your stuff, right? Or they're going to capture them. Remember that especially humanoid monsters are almost always going to try to do something other than just kill the players. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, so I don't want to get too far into it. But there are other options. They can absolutely capture them, and there are good sort of narrative in-universe reasons why they'd want to capture people. And why not? Let's talk about it right now. Why go too far? So yeah, this kind of ties into monster motivation, but they can absolutely capture them and try to ransom them. They want their gear because their gear represents a bunch of money. They can ransom them because that represents a bunch of money. Right, your player characters ostensibly sort of like as D&D kind of works is that this person's walking around with like a lot of money on them in gear and or actual just a lot of money on them, right? And most monsters, even though we don't do a great job of explaining that sometimes in universe, they want the money, right? They want that. Um, Even though you might, if you think about it for a few seconds, be like, actually, what are these goblins going to do with a whole bunch of money? Like, it's not, especially if they're like monstrous, right? They're not going to just like roll up into town next week for a big shopping trip and like paint the town red and like buy everybody drinks and have like. So what are they going to do with all this money? This is a really good place to like drop in those NPCs that are sort of like neutral NPCs in like Dungeons and Adventures, and be like, there are traders who go out and like trade with goblins or kobolds, right? There are people who are willing to make money that way. They're willing to take the risk as sort of traders to go out to monster lairs and sell them things and take their gold and give them gold for adventuring gear that they take back to town and sell to adventurers, that sort of stuff, or ransoming and all that stuff, right? There are ways to sort of build that in, but you do have to kind of think about it a little bit, right? As sort of the strategy. But there are plenty of sort of like non-death resolutions for most monsters. Now, things get a little bit more murky, of course, when you deal with like undead or constructs. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to say that constructs probably don't, once they knock a player character to 0, they probably don't go in for the kill. You can probably just do that as programming. If there is, something, an intruder that's moving about and that intruder stops moving around, they'll consider that threat neutralized, which I think is pretty reasonable. Be like, so they'll knock you down they'll KO you, but they're not going to like coup de grace you. They're not going to just like immediately kill you. They're like, oh, they must be dead or neutralized because they're not moving anymore, and just kind of move on to other characters. So even if you could have a construct based combat in which they attack and TPK an entire party, knock the entire party down to 0, and then just kind of like walk away. And that you can probably provide that in game as a narrative way to be like, well, yeah, they neutralized the threat, so they moved on, right? That sort of thing. Um, the other way to kind of talk about it is you can kind of return to sort of like basics. When you know who's going to win the fight, kind of stop fighting. It's easy, even if you are using something like zombies or some other undead that aren't going to stop until they're reduced to 0 hit points. If the momentum's on the player character's side, you can be like, I'm going to give them an extra round, one more round of like a full attacks, and then I'm just going to narratively end the fight. It'd be like, you guys do some cleanup actions, they do a round of fights, you take another like 4 points of damage from the zombies as they sort of scratch at you and bite at you, but you end up just clearing out the rest of them without much of a problem, right? And then they're not spending resources, and it's not them like waiting them to roll dice to hit with melee attacks or using cantrips, because they're like, well, the momentum's on our side, we've clearly going to win this fight, so I don't want to use like any like leveled spell slots, and I don't want to use like any sort of like big character abilities for a fight that's already won, right? So you can boil it down that way. And the other great thing about doing like morale or non-death resolutions very, very quickly, trying to sort of cut off that end of the combat once it's already clear like how the combat's going to go, is that it's going to give you more time in the session, right? Which is what we're looking for. So you're going to cut off the end of the fight, and you're going to save that last 10-15 minutes of people just rolling dice, being like, okay, I did another 9 points of damage to this creature, and be like, oh, well, the zombie made their save, so they're technically still up with 1 hit point, right? And so that's sort of like flat, unfulfilling, kind of boring into the combat, and you can take that stuff and put it back into the session as more like that social, that exploration, even another combat. If you run up into it, it gives you more time, and you can more densely pack the good content in your sessions, which is always a good thing as a dungeon master, right? To always feel like there's always good stuff that's going on, and there's not as much sort of like flat kind of downtime in it. Yeah, goblins are cowards. Yeah, absolutely. Goblins, kobolds, all those low level bad guys have a tendency to be cowards in general, right? That's sort of built into their ecology. So if you've read the stat block and you've read sort of like the write up that's next to them, and you kind of understand a little bit about the creatures, it makes sense that they run from big nasty adventuring parties, right? It makes total sense. It's if you can make it make sense in the game, it's going to feel like it makes sense. I just said if it makes sense, it makes sense. That's that's not a great sentence. I think about it, that's not really a point. But the idea is like if you can make the game mechanics fit that sort of in-universe feeling, things are going to be very, very natural. The game's going to feel really immersive and really good if you could do that. If you can have that, our $5 word, that ludo narrative resonance, right? Not dissonance, resonance. Like the things that I do, engaging with the game and the mechanics of the game, feel just like naturally what would happen in this sort of narrative situation. Exactly the same. So I'm going to take a quick break. We're going to jump to the veteran level, which I probably spent too much time doing the apprentice level, but that's okay because I think the apprentice level is the most important because I think that's where a lot of new DMs kind of stumble a lot of times. So we'll probably try to quicken things up and move through the other ones, but I because I feel like especially new DMs are really really at that sort of apprentice level that's where the meatiest part's going to be for a lot of specifically not super experienced dungeon masters or dungeon masters that have maybe only run like published stuff and are kind of trying to get into homebrew stuff. I think these three big points, the CR, the adventure tiers, the action economy is really important. The monster strategy is really important, and being able to find a way to clear out combat encounters that are not death resolutions. So I'm going to take a very quick break. I'm going to refill my coffee because I'm out of coffee, and we'll be back in just a second, and we'll move on to the veteran level. So stay tuned. If that information all sounded straightforward to you, well, we got more stuff coming, so don't worry about it. And I will be back in just a second, guys. All right, bye. All right, let's go ahead and hop back into it. I realize we have been going for a while now, and I'm probably not going to get through all of these, so I'll probably have to end up breaking this up into 2 streams, because we are a ways in, and I'm only now getting to the second hand. That's okay. I really wanted to spend like I said, I wanted to spend a lot of time on that sort of apprentice level, because I think it's the most relevant to specifically newer DMs who are just trying to, stumbling baby birds into their way of trying to figure out how to do encounter building and thinking about these things that, again, like that, it's specifically the 5th edition DM, she just doesn't explain to you, right? It doesn't really tell you. There's not really a good source, published, official first-party source that just tells you how to do some of this stuff, right? So, let's go ahead and hop in. So we did the apprentice level, so that was sort of, like, if you're new and you've come in and you're like, this is your first time trying to homebrew, or you've tried to homebrew some adventures, and you feel like you don't have a good handle on it, that stuff's all for you. So now we're moving on to sort of the veteran level, which is, I kind of consider like, okay, you've definitely done some homebrew. Maybe you're getting to the point where you've figured out some of this stuff, right? You figured out, okay, not every encounter has to end in death. Not every encounter, like, monsters should have some idea of, like, what they're doing, right? You can't just make an encounter and be like, okay, there's 4 bugbears, and just drop them in and be like, okay, that's the encounter. Like, being like, okay, but like, what are they gonna do? Like, what are they trying to do in the encounter? They're trying to build it that way. And right, you're very familiar now. You've come to the realization that CR is not a good metric for measuring nearly anything. It's important to kind of understand those adventure tiers, and you know sort of like the action economy play, especially in 5e, with that flat math, and why it's so much more important than like the raw damage into hits and that sort of stuff. So in the veteran level, the first thing you kind of mix up, the thing that's really going to change you, and I'm going to use that example from yesterday. I talked about that really nice VTT map, but it didn't do the one thing that it really needs to do, which is environmental use. They tried to do a little bit of it towards the end, but at that point it was way too late in the encounter for it to make any sort of difference. Actually, we'll talk about it. So what do we mean by environmental use? So we're talking about, just put it in here, we're talking about terrain. So terrain covers impassable terrain, difficult terrain, things like water, creatures that can fly through the air. That's sort of like using the whole sort of 3D aspect of the combat space, and what kind of goes into that. Like, how do monsters and how do player characters move through that space? Which includes the Z-axis. If you have player characters that can fly, or you have monsters that can fly, right? Those are going to be really important. And even if you don't, you could still set up elevation. Elevation can still be a key part of your sort of encounter design. As a veteran level, you feel pretty solid about the combatant aspect. So now you're kind of looking at things that are sort of a little bit outside of that. Like, you understand, like at a glance, or when you're building encounters, the sort of number of sort of monsters to add to it, the sort of types of monsters, and kind of like their strategy and how they should do that sort of stuff. So now we're looking at environmental use, which can play into that sort of monster strategy as well. Like, this is where we move from, like, that apprentice level DM, that very low level DM, I mean, not very low, but low level, introductory level, let's put it that way. Introductory level sort of like DM craft, Dungeon Master craft, Game Master craft, where you're thinking about adventures and you want to move encounters from basically the X-Men Danger Room, that featureless flat plane, which is, if you've done a lot of this and you've started to look at people like on Reddit or things where people talk about it, they almost always talk about it as sort of like this white featureless plane box that combats happen in. And environmental use kind of is meant to sort of like push you out of that. Be like, no, you should, like, the physical space that this combat encounter is going to take place in is really, really important. And that includes terrain, because that's going to detail like how quickly specifically your melee characters and monsters are going to be able to move around, right? Whether that's, flyby attacks and having things like ladders where they can climb, maybe they have elevated platforms that they can shoot from, those sorts of things that and you can use it as a way to sort of like control or funnel how you kind of want player characters to move through that encounter. So, like I said, if you have that standard operating procedure for players, for the player group, if you can do anything to sort of like make them have to mix up their tactics. So if we have that encounter where in that first round, the fighter or paladin or whoever your big beefy defender tank kind of character can't get to the bad guys, that's going to change the way that the combat's going to go, right? If they can't lock down those characters really quickly, those monsters really quickly, right? Immediately the combat's going to be different. And the same thing works for your ranged characters. If they can't create that space between bad guys, right? So we can look at terrain as one of those ways. So there's impassable terrain, there's air. Is swimming a part of that, right? If you're doing any sort of water-based character or amphibious-based character, the water should play probably a relatively big role in that. There's a number of encounters that I see, whether all the way from sort of like published D&D, like actual plays, like well-known actual plays, all the way down to sort of like modules or one-shots that are on like the DM's Guild or stuff like that use things like bullywugs or grung and then don't make water an important part of that. Like a big feature of that combat is wild. There are so many. But like you have an amphibious creatures, by their nature they should be around water most of the time. And water is not a thing that most player characters can do very well, right? So it provides this really great sort of tactical terrain advantage. Like, they can't move through it very quickly. If they have heavy armor, right, they might sink like a rock. They could drown. I mean, likelihood of a player character drowning is really small, especially if it's like a lake or a river or something like that. Now, a big open ocean, sure, maybe. But as far as sort of like small bodies of water, not really much of a concern, especially not deep water. But that sort of terrain and how they move through the space. So we'll say terrain. We'll also say like dimensions. Right? If you do a combat in a small room or a small sort of like physical space, those ranged characters are not going to be able to get away from melee bad guys, and vice versa. So if you're like, you want to do like a really cool, like a really harrowing, let's say ghoul encounter or something like that, put them in a tight box where those ranged characters can't get away from them very easily, and the ghouls can scramble after them. They're always going to be on top of them, right? That will take a combat that might be a relatively easy combat and make it actually pretty difficult if those characters that usually don't get up in the mix with monsters in their face can't get away from the monsters very easily. Very similar. So if you have a small box, you make it difficult terrain where they can't move really quickly, especially if there's some sort of terrain or movement feature that the monsters have that the player characters don't, is always really key. So if you have gargoyles or homunculi or something that can fly, is always really, really useful. Peritons are a good example. Not Axebeaks. I'm trying to think of a low-level creature that has burrowing speeds. Something that has a burrowing speed. Other than basic beasts, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that's low level that has a burrowing speed. I know that they exist. I just can't think of one off the top of my head. But that, or something that like spiders or things like that have climb speeds, and you can make platforms that are really, really narrow, right? If you want to do those sorts of, like, they're walking along a like barren, narrow mountain path or something like that, and have like creatures that have climb speeds like coming down or coming up from across the path, where they don't have to worry about that sort of like single file line to stay there. And then you also have really cool things where the player characters can try to like do forced movement or push or something like that to kind of like knock them off the mountain, which could be a really cool thing for the players to do, right? Immediately, it's already a way more interesting combat than being like, there's 4 guys and a couple of spiders, right? And a flat, featureless plane where the spiders run up. They run at each other and attack each other, right? That's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid that very, very cliche run, the stick and stay model, where they run at each other and then they stay, and then the range characters just sit in the back and do the thing that they try to do all the time. So anytime you can mix that up is always really, really good. So I'm talking about terrain and dimensions. The other thing we talked about, and we talked about it a little bit already, but elevation, right, is very key to that. Like a really, really good way to mix up a very, very standard combat is to add a second story. To have like a mezzanine, a balcony, a gallery, something like that, a staircase that leads up to like a split level arena, right? You have a basement floor and then you have a partial split level. You can put archers and stuff up on that split level and shooting down, and then some characters like, all right, well, we got to get up there and deal with those people, right? Otherwise they're just going to sit here and like take pot shots at us the entire encounter. A good example, or technically a bad example, that from a game that I ran a very, very long time ago, but always sticks out in my mind, was a 4th edition game, used minions that we talked about earlier. Is I had an arena sort of set up, a combat encounter setup that had like a really big, beefy, what they call brutes in 4E, so it's just a monster that hits really hard, but it's super easy to hit. They have really low AC, they don't have super great dex saves, things like that, but they're basically just like a big old glass of hit points, really. But they do a lot of damage, but they have pretty low attack, so they, you know, it's that very classic, like if you think about the Lord of the Rings sort of Mines of Moria cave troll encounter, that fight, like you have this big cave troll that swings around a big club, like really dangerous, but really doesn't hit things most of the time. So it's a lot of sort of like pantomime theater. So it really swings a lot and be like, oh, but if you get hit, and that one character gets hit in the combat, they're going to take a bunch of damage, and they're like, oh, well, that's a real threat. When really the threat are the minions who are sitting up, and they were on top of, I think they were on top of huts. Whatever it was, they were elevated off the ground. And they were just sitting there, and in 4th edition, like, minions do low-level damage, and they just do static damage. They don't roll dice, so they're just sitting there taking pot shots at, like, 3 hit points apiece, and there's a handful of them. There's probably, like, half a dozen of them. Just kind of around. But the arena itself, that middle area with the brute, doesn't have any cover. But this danger level of the brute, like, all the party is focused on taking down this brute, and like I said, they're just a big stack of hit points, so they can just survive for rounds and rounds and rounds, and they're just soaking all that damage. Meanwhile, the minions back here that nobody's paying attention to are consistently just making attacks. They're consistently doing, you know, there's 6 of them, they do 3 damage per, they're pretty consistently doing, you know, 9 to 12 points of damage in general, hitting most of the time. And they're just, you know, each one kind of picked a different player character and just kind of shot them. But when you look at 12 damage over, you know, 3+ rounds, that's enough to take down a player character. And that's what happened. I ended up in a TPK, and I'm like, as a DM, I'm like, I don't know what you guys want me to do. Like, you guys didn't pay attention to the things that were actively killing you. I can't, like, other than being like, oh, that guy shot you again with another arrow. You have like 4 arrows sticking out of you. Do you want to do something about that? No, I kind of want to keep fighting this. I think it was an ogre. I want to keep fighting this ogre. Oh, okay. Right. But it makes it very easy, like, a little elevation, like, they could have gotten to him, right? But because, like, it was like 5 to 10 feet to climb up. Like, it's a simple action. They could have gotten up there, even the melee character, gotten up there and attacked them. But that separation can make a world of difference in encounter design, right? And again, as far as sort of like the encounter building, like, math portion, the budget for that was not budgeted as like some sort of deadly encounter. I think it was budgeted as sort of like a medium style encounter. Like, it was not supposed to be a very important encounter in that adventure. It was just supposed to be like a middle of the road encounter. but they ended up, tanking because of it. That and, the players always, every player group I think I've ever played with, there's really bad about, and this is somewhat a lot of RPG's fault, about really bad at, through the mechanics, communicating that you should run from an encounter. Right? Players in general, especially newer players, kind of come to D&D or whatever the RPG is, tabletop RPG is, with the idea that they have real bad main character syndrome, right? The idea that if there's a fight in front of them, they are supposed to be able to win the day, right? They're supposed to be able to make it all the way through that encounter. And that doesn't always make sense. Sometimes they're really, really difficult encounters. And you do your best as a DM to be like, hey, like, this is a bad encounter. Like, you should probably not pursue this. This is very dangerous. And then sometimes like this, it's like, it was a very simple encounter, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted to the monster side, and that they were probably going to win the combat. And the players just didn't have that sort of meta-awareness to be like, it's not even meta-awareness, that could be in-game awareness to be like, we're gonna die if we keep going at this fight. Like, we need to run. But that's a bit of a tangent. But basically, to use that environmental use can really, really help add a level of not even complexity or difficulty, just it's almost a level of novelty to a lot of combats, right? And so in the game the encounter that we did last night, we had the DM had set up these vats of chemicals that were going to spill out, that the necromancer could use their magic to sort of like open the valves on, and they would spill out all over the place. The problem is that none of the player characters moved to the middle of the room, because we never needed to be in the middle of the room. We had a couple of ranged characters that sat in the back doing the range thing, and those who were melee attackers went after the necromancer, who was at the far end of the room. And so by the time, this is probably like round 3 or 4, that the DM was like, oh, I need to open up the valves. And it was like, all right, and you hear that happen, and then there was like, technically there's one PC in the middle of the room, but they're flying because we have a character that's a fairy, and so it's like they're flying. They were even said like, I am flying, right? I am flying over this. We had a little riser for them to stand on. Like, they are clearly flying in the middle of this room. And so it kind of opened up the valves, and like all this sort of like caustic chemical stuff is in the middle of the room, but none of the guys are there because they don't need to be there. As well, there are a bunch of tables and sort of like chemistry sets and stuff like that that are sort of like around the room, but never really played a part of the actual encounter. So definitely kind of use that terrain and dimensions and that elevation to... It's not enough to just have it. It has to have some sort of use in there, right? It has to do something. But you can add those very, very very easily into the encounters, and they can make a huge difference if you build an encounter around that, right? You don't want to build the encounter and then add the stuff in. Generally, you kind of want to figure out what the box is going to be while you're doing it at the same time, or figure out what the arena is kind of going to be, and then figure out monsters that make sense who can utilize that arena. So we talked about terrain, talked about dimensions, talked about light and concealment. This is another one that really, I feel like a lot of DMs don't use very much. Light, incredibly important, especially in 5e. It's very important, especially if you're a new Dungeon Master. Go back and read the light rules. Dark vision doesn't probably work how you think it works. It's a bad name. It really should be low light vision. That's what they should call it. It's not dark vision. It just allows you to see better in dim light. It doesn't actually allow you to see in like pitch blackness. Right? So it really should be low light vision, not dark vision. But light's really important. And basically, all player characters pretty much need light. in some form or fashion, either bright light or some sort of like dim light, like torchlight, things like that they can get away with. And most monsters need it, but not all monsters. Some monsters have true sight, some monsters have blind sight, some monsters have tremor sense. And so if you set up encounters where light's going to play a big factor, because light ties into concealment, which is another thing that doesn't get used very often. And I try to use it in the solo RPG series, but I remember like 2 sessions back, technically it was raining quite heavily, and that should have given me concealment, and I forgot about it. And so we had a very range-based combat that really shouldn't have gone that way. So light concealment, which is sort of light mist, dim lights, things like that, give a +2 to AC and Dex saving throws. Sorry, I'm looking at I have it written down. Look at my DM's binder. Gives a +2 to AC and Dex saves. That's super useful. Like we said, if you're looking at the monster stat blocks and you're like, oh, these monsters have really crappy AC, or they don't really have very good Dex saves. Well, we know that Dex saves are the most common Dex saves, or the most common save in the game, right? Regardless, really, of pretty much any game you're playing, whether that's 5e or something else. A dexterity or the equivalent reflex save, etc. Most common saves in the game. We know that. And armor class, the 2-hit also. So those two things probably represent, I don't know, what, 70% of attacks and actions. And so if you want to boost those up, right, if you're running something, like you can turn something like a zombie encounter into a real nightmare scenario if you can remove light and start giving them concealment. And you could just hear the groans and moving of bodies shambling in the darkness. That's very creepy now that I think about it. I should probably do that at some point. I don't think I've done that. But yeah. So adding lighting concealment. So concealment can be mist, it can be fog. So light concealment gives you that +2 to AC and Dex, and then heavy concealment is treated as basically the I'm looking at cover. I'm looking at the wrong stupid thing. Light obscurement, sorry, we don't call it concealment in 5e, we call it obscurement. Gives disadvantage on perception checks. So strike everything I just said about that, because it's actually about cover. Sorry, my bad. Concealment is more about, so with the perception, it's a really great way to hide traps. So if you want to integrate traps, traps or hazards into combats, or if you have a spellcaster that can turn invisible, right? And then maybe you have clever players who try to figure out ways to sort of get around the invisibility rather than just see invisibility or something like that. Having that concealment aspect, that disadvantage to perception, even if they have something like tremor sense or true sight or see invisibility or even fairy fire or something like that, that's going to allow them to see invisible creatures, you can actually sort of mitigate some of that offhand, which can make your invisible enemies or traps way more potent and way more dangerous for people to sort of like walk into, as well as heavy obscurement, which is as if you were blinded, which is very bad. The blinded condition, let me get my notes. So automatically fail sight-based checks, specifically perception checks, but I would argue investigation checks too. Attacks have disadvantage, and the attacker has advantage on you if they can see you. So, right, heavy obscurement can really change the way that you deal with something, especially if you have an encounter that maybe you have a very strong player party that uses a lot of ranged combat, right? They often deal with combats before they actually get to their doorstep, right? Before they get toe-to-toe. They have really powerful ranged options. Being able to give them that sort of blinded condition as things sort of like swarm, like if I'm thinking like a misty wood or something like that, a foggy wood, and then just have like enemies swarm out of that mist, right? Coming out of the mist. It's a very easy way to sort of like put them on their heels, right? Change up their tactics, allow them to, in this one specific circumstance, not do the thing they usually do. Now, you can't always do that, right? That's part of it. Is sometimes there is some power fantasy, especially in D&D. Like, you want them to also have cool moments too, but not every. Especially at this veteran level, we run into combats. I feel like a lot of DMs kind of run into those combats where every combat they build kind of feels the same. This is a good way to sort of mix that stuff up. So having concealment and light as an important part of those encounters is very cool. Especially because so many monsters have dark vision compared to player characters, or alternative senses that work very well for them, whether that's, smelling or hearing or tremor sense, like tactile sensations. They have a lot of cool ways to get around that stuff, which can really, really kind of make a dungeon, specifically a dungeon, feel very oppressive. Like when they are clinging to the light source that they have. Like, if this light source goes out, that's a real problem. It also, like we said, can change sort of your monster strategy. Well, if the monsters, whatever they are relatively intelligent, even if they're not intelligent, maybe, and they don't need light for whatever reason, they might try to snuff the light out of the player characters, right? Instead of attacking the wizard, they may just try to, like, get rid of whatever they've casted light on. If they've done that wizard thing where they cast light on a gold piece or whatever, or they do the Gandalf little crystal and the staff thing, and they're just like, I'm just gonna, like, rip this staff away from the wizard and toss it down the hole, which is, again, a great way to deal with a wizard with a really crappy strength score most of the time, is be like, I'm gonna literally bully this wizard and just literally take their spell casting focus away from them and push them down on the ground. I'll rip the book out of their hands, cast your spells now, buddy, and kick them down on the ground. But again, like, you only do that if you have some relatively intelligent creatures. Like, if we go back to that bugbear example, that's absolutely one of the things the bugbears might do, right? They see that cleric raise somebody with their little holy symbol around their neck and be like, well, I'll just rip that thing off the cleric and toss it away, right? To do those sorts of, like, not straightforward attacks and do different sort of tactics to kind of mix things up and be always, like, really helps to kind of, if you have an overconfident group of players who have really had a really easy time with a bunch of stuff, and just you can be like, yeah, but I can, as DM, be like, I can take that away very easily in a lot of circumstances. So, be, and not in a, like, mean-spirited, like, you guys don't respect me as a DM, but just, like, as characters in the world, like, you are powerful characters, but you are not invincible, and you rely on very specific tools, and those tools can be taken from you surprisingly easily. So that sort of thing. Again, just to sort of, like, mix things up. So, right, use the environment. That's a big way to say use the environment. Another good way, I'm trying to think. Hazards, right? If we add hazards in, so if you have hazards, there are a lot of, like, molds or things that do, like, poison damage. If you have monsters that are immune to poison or resistant to poison, use those in conjunction, and we'll talk about that. Actually, we can talk about that right now. Let's go ahead and talk about that right now. Let's go to monster pick and mix. So what we're talking about is monster pick and mix or team and arena symbiosis, right? Using arenas, like I just said, if you have monsters that are resistant or immune to poison damage, put them in an arena with poison in it that has some sort of hazard or fungus or something that does that sort of damage. Like, there are so many monsters in 5e that have just this litany in their stat block of things they're resistant to, things they're immune to. And that's a good idea to be like, okay, well, that's the sort of environments that they can be in, that other creatures wouldn't be in, so that's kind of a safe haven for them usually. So we can put them in there and have add a complexity and a difficulty to a combat encounter that you don't have to deal with as DM, right? You don't have to be like, all right, this guy, right, I have to roll for his lightning damage, and be like, no, it's a shambling mound or whatever, like they're immune to lightning damage, right? Like, so you don't have to worry about it. It's no more cognitive load from your end to add that stuff in, and because you don't have to keep track of it for your own monsters. Even though maybe shambling mound's not a very good example, because I believe they get hit points back from lightning. Let's say Dwergar and I don't know, a poisonous mushroom chamber, right? They have resistance to it, so they're likely not going to take a ton of poison damage from it. But most player characters, unless they're also dwarves, are probably going to take that poison damage. Or they're going to take the poison condition, which is, in a lot of ways, even worse. Right? To give them... Well, I guess poison damage only does ability checks, I think. I don't think it does attacks and saves. I think it's just ability checks. So, I mean, but it's still bad. It's still not great. So doing those sorts of things, so looking at that arena symbiosis with the monsters you pick, and then choosing monsters that work with each other. So monsters that... Let me see if come up with a good example off the top of my head for symbiosis that works together. So let's say something like ghouls, and then putting ghouls together, because ghouls have that paralytic aspect to them. Or let's do carrion crawlers, which also have paralytic poison to them. So having something that's paralytic poison, actually just ghouls and carrion crawlers together would be kind of weird. Sort of. Not impossible. That's not an impossible encounter, but it would be kind of a weird encounter. It would be more of a three-way encounter than a two-way encounter, right? You'd probably have ghouls fighting carrion crawlers fighting players, which is a little bit messy. But monsters that have some sort of symbiosis together. So if we put, let's say you wanted to use something like I don't know, again, kind of a weird aspect, but maybe we're going to reflavor something like a giant toad or a giant snake or something like that. Something that eats creatures, right? We have a number of those creatures that sort of like grab creatures, and if you don't break the grab, they suck you in. Ankegs do that. And doing that with something like ghouls, something else that has that sort of paralytic touch to them. So you have this sort of paralytic touch, which is going to basically make them fail saves, and then make them very susceptible to attacks, and then you have this character that's going to attack them and grab them, and then if they're paralyzed, they're going to have a really difficult time. Like, somebody else is going to have to get them out of that grab because they're not going to be able to escape themselves, and the monster's just going to gobble them up. So that's two monsters that can kind of work together, and right, you'd probably reflavor the giant toad as some sort of like undead ghoul toad or something like that, which could be a lot of fun. Just kind of, right, we can just reskin that, and then maybe you give it some ghoul abilities or ghoul resistances, etc. That sort of thing. Maybe they're vulnerable to radiant, maybe the toad's vulnerable to radiant damage or something like that. Something that makes sense, that kind of reflavors it. So using monsters that work with each other really well, and monsters that work with the arena. Now, you don't want to overcorrect. You don't want to make it, because if you go too far in one direction, you're going to end up turning what might be a very easy encounter into an absolutely deadly encounter. So you don't want to go too far, right? Like, if we did that, if we put the ghouls and the undead toad in the, let's say, the poison mushroom, maybe they're ghoul dwergar and this undead toad, and they're all in this sort of like poisonous mushroom pond underground lake chamber kind of thing. And so you've got this thing where you've got water in there, and they're pulling things into the water, and player characters don't deal well with water, and maybe they're paralyzed, and you pull them into the water, and even if you get them out of the grab, they're still actively drowning because they're paralyzed underwater, right? You can have all sorts of weird things like that. So you can accidentally waterfall yourself into absolutely murdering an entire party of player characters that you didn't mean to. So, right, you don't want to have too much synergy. You want to have symbiosis, but not so much synergy to the point where you're just creating a death trap, right? Unless you want to. I mean, I guess you might want to do that. Hopefully you're not. As DM, don't really do that. Unless you're trying to do it for a very specific reason. Maybe a capstone encounter for like a one shot that you really want to like sell as being like super deadly or something like that, to really sort of challenge the players or something like that, and maybe do it in something like that. But in general, probably don't want to do that. But a little bit of synergy goes a long ways of that pick and mix. The same thing works. The 4E Dungeon Master's Guide, again, was really good about this, but 5e doesn't have anything like that, and most game systems don't have anything like that, where they had roles assigned to monsters, where you had brutes and soldiers and skirmishers and ambushers and controllers, and so each, in the same way that we think about like MMOs, tanks, DPS, healers, those sorts of crowd control, those sorts of things, like in 4E, monsters had roles that were kind of like that. So you could know, like, hey, you could put together a soldier who has really good defensive capabilities and pretty decent attacks, who's basically the monster version of a tank, right? You put them in there, and then you throw some ranged characters in the back, maybe some ambushers that can hide and pop out and do some extra damage if they're hiding, and you have that tank that's just sort of like doing his E Honda impression, just like keeping players at bay, trying to keep them away from the archers who are doing their archery thing, that sort of thing. So that symbiosis really helps. Again, there's no in-game mechanical language, specifically in 5e, that does anything like that. But if you look for it, you're going to be able to find that stuff. But again, that's why you got to look at the monster stat blocks when you're building the encounters, and really actually read them and see how they work together, and try to figure out why these monsters would be together. And reflavor them if you need to. Like I said with our undead toad. So we have that. We have, so the next thing I want to talk about is, let's put it this way. Let's say variable difficulty. Variable difficulty for encounters is really important, regardless of what tabletop RPG you're playing. You want, and again, when we're talking about this veteran level, we're talking about DMs and game masters who have a situation where they feel like they're moving towards like encounter singularity, where encounters start to really feel the same. And so we kind of want to get away from that, right? And so this is one of the things, is that the easiest way to do that is to literally change the like math aspect difficulty. It's not every encounter needs to be a medium balanced, perfectly honed encounter. It's very important to have super easy encounters and also super difficult encounters. So one of the things that I have that's sort of like in my checklist of like making adventures or dungeons or something like that is, and this kind of goes back, they don't use this very specific language in the Goblin Punch sort of adventure checklist, but it's something very similar, is what I call cupcake encounters and sledgehammer encounters. Is that I feel like a good adventure should have a really easy encounter, and I think Goblin Punch talks about it as an encounter, a monsters for you to attack, and then monsters to attack you, is to have encounters that are both the boost confidence, right, a really super easy encounter that kind of lure the players into this sort of sense of security or ease that's not true, right? Kind of this false sense of confidence by having like, and they get the fun of like steamrolling that encounter, right? You have those 50 plus shadows and the cleric gets to do the cool cleric thing, and they obliterate all the shadows in the encounter, and they're like, everybody feels great, there's high fives around the table, everybody feels good, and the cleric's like, I did the thing that I almost never get to do. That was fun. Thank you, DM, for giving me an opportunity to do that. And then on the other hand, you have the sledgehammer encounter, the encounter that kind of comes out of nowhere and knocks the party on its butt, right? Really puts the fear of God in them. That's our or giant toad in the fungal underground pond with the ghouls and, you know, grabbing people and pulling them underwater while they're paralyzed and actively drowning, all that stuff. Like an encounter that's designed to be like, hey, if you're not playing to a high level of competency and you don't make smart decisions and the dice aren't on your side, like, a player character can absolutely just full on die here. Like, that is almost a given. And so the sledgehammer encounter is like an encounter that's gonna soak up a lot of their resources as player characters, that's going to really put a lot of fear of God in them, really beat them up. That's what it's for. And generally the way that I sort of construct that in sort of like the meta narrative of an adventure when I'm planning an entire adventure is that I want the sledgehammer encounter to not be, this might seem a little counterintuitive, especially for newer DMs, not the big bad evil guy. It's not the villain encounter. That's very specifically that it's not that encounter. You might go, wait, you don't want to make the capstone like villain encounter, the BBEG, the most difficult fight? No. And let me give you the situation. As a DM, especially somebody who's coming in at that veteran level, you've run some stuff, you've done some homebrew, you've been around the block a couple of times. You've had this probably situation, you're like, I've got this really good encounter, it's all peeled up, I've built up this big bad guy, and then the player characters know it's coming, they're hyped for the fight, and they come in and they alpha strike and they absolutely demolish that encounter, right? We've all been there, especially with solo encounters, that the players just roll up, they've saved up all their abilities, and they just curb stomp a villain, right? We've all been there. It happens. It still happens, like, even if you've run the game for, 20 years, like, you're not immune to that, like, it still happens. Especially if the players know that there's a very specific villain or big bad monster in there, they're gonna save up their resources to deal with that big bad monster. Which is why I don't want to make the toughest encounter that encounter. So here's basically two scenarios. So the first thing is let's say they're going through the dungeon or the adventure or whatever, and they run into the sledgehammer encounter before they run into the big bad evil guy encounter. So they run into the sledgehammer encounter, and they've been maybe waltzing through, they've had the cupcake, they've had a couple maybe medium fights in there, and they're feeling pretty good, they've used some spell slots, but not a ton, they're playing very conservatively, they're maybe going around stuff, and then they hit this sledgehammer encounter, and in the first round there's gonna be an oh shit moment, right? There's gonna be a moment where they're like, oh god, I gotta use some spell slots here. I gotta do some abilities here. And you want them, and this is a whittling away. This is I'm gonna take some resources fight. That's what it's been. It's a resource management game. You're gonna be like, I need to take spell slots away from them, and their big, more powerful abilities away from them, so that way, by the time they get to the big bad evil guy, they get to the villain, they're not at like full alpha strike capabilities, right? That's gonna make this villain encounter much more thematic, right? They're gonna feel villainous because the villain's gonna have all their powers, right? They've got all of their great powers, but if they've gone through the sledgehammer encounters, the player character, the party, they might be rocking up at like 50%. If they've gone through an entire dungeon, they just went through the hardest fight in the dungeon to get there. So they're rolling up at 50% against the big bad evil guy. And right, he doesn't have any other encounters today. He's a one encounter a day, 15-minute workday kind of bad guy, right? He's gonna unload on them, right? He's gonna try to do his best to murder them, right? Because they're a villain. They're the big nasty. That's what they do, right? And it's gonna feel really thematic because they're gonna be not at full strike capabilities. It is very crucial, right, that you don't let the party rest in the middle of that you try to push them away from trying to take a full rest before they go in to fight a big bad evil guy, which is, I think, a trap that a lot of especially newer DMs will fall into. Well, they'll struggle with ways to keep the players from taking rests, which is a different sort of like aspect of DMing, to try to keep that tension and timers and all that stuff. But that's outside of combat building. Even this is a little bit more adventure design. But the idea of having a variable difficulty, about having, let me just write here, cupcakes and sledgehammers. For your adventure. And if it's a long adventure, you can have multiples of them. You can kind of think, I kind of think of sledgehammer encounters as sort of like lieutenants for the villains. Those usually make for good sledgehammer encounters, or like if you want to think of like very, very, I mean, maybe not that old school, but old school video game design, I'm thinking like Mega Man style. You have mini bosses, right? Levels have mini bosses in them. It's sort of like the halfway point or something. Something that's sort of like a skill check area, right? Be like, all right, you've got a tough fight coming up. Then you see the autosave function pop up when you're playing, like, crap, I'm about to go into a difficult encounter, aren't I? Yeah. So that's what happens when you have the sledgehammers before, is that you're softening them up for the actual thematic capstone encounter. Now, because if you're running a game that has a high level of player choice, which I assume you are because you're running a tabletop RPG, and that's the strength of playing these types of games, is that you have a human orchestrating it, is that you can improvise a lot, right? So having an improvisation that kind of jumps in and has the ability to be like, oh, well, we actually avoid the sledgehammer encounter. We saw it and then we snuck around it. Or if you're playing a very sort of JK, the dungeon kind of thing, where it's got a bunch of loops in it, and there's easily there's a path that you can take that will very easily get you to the boss, the main villain, whatever that sort of climax encounter is, without going through the sledgehammer encounter. You can do that, and that's okay. The second thing is that, so if they don't do the sledgehammer encounter, they get to the big bad evil guy, they played conservatively, they have their stuff, they alpha strike, they blow, for lack of better terms, they blow their load, right, on the big bad evil guy, right, on the villain. They're like, I use all my top level spell slots, I use everything I got, we use every single ability at our disposal, we use all our consumables, and we, maybe it's depending on how the encounter's built, maybe that's still a pretty dragged out, pretty back and forth hard fight. Maybe it's not that hard. And they feel really great about it, and they're like, regardless, and they're like, yeah, we beat the bad guy, we saved the day, we get the loot, etc., etc. Well, let's check out the rest of the dungeon, or make our way back to the beginning, and be like, uh-oh, here's a sledgehammer encounter. Hope you were ready for the hardest fight in the whole adventure. Oh, you just used all your really good abilities on something else, huh? Ooh. This is going to be interesting. And so the idea is that if you do that basically once, it's going to do two kind of really cool things once you do it for the first time. The first time is that you're going to kick their butt, and they're going to be like, whoa, okay, so note to self, like, don't use every single high-level ability in any single fight, right? We need to play conservatively, but play more balanced, right? Be like, hey, when there's a tough fight, it's okay to use high-level abilities, even if it's not the big bad evil guy. We need to be more balanced in how we use our resources, our abilities, and our spell slots and stuff like that. Like, it's okay to burn those higher-level spell slots to deal with a tough encounter, and not save it for the very end, like capstone encounter. Similarly, the other thing it's going to do is you're going to have a really cool narrative thing. Now, assuming they went through, they used every single thing at their resource, taking out the big bad evil guy, which is again why we kind of use like a lieutenant or something like that is really, really good for these sledgehammer encounters. Well, their second in command, maybe they have to run from that encounter. But now you've got this cool DM narrative thread where you're like, hey, by the way, there's a super powerful bad guy who's still out there, and he's already cleaned your plate once, and they're gonna do it again. And guess what? They're the new big bad, right? They have all the resources of the last big bad, and they have very intimate knowledge of your capabilities as players, and they know who you are. And they're just in the wind somewhere, so there is some terrifying foe that's just out there who means you harm. Which is a really cool way to like spin off to a totally different adventure, right? Or have this sort of set up this sort of like recurring villain that kind of shows up, right? They can show up. So it does that. Very cool. So it does those two really, really cool things for that. And the last thing, on top of cupcakes and sledgehammers, and sort of making sure that there's hard encounters and easy encounters and middle of the road encounters. So there's never this feeling that every encounter is going to feel the same for you as a DM and for the players. And the nice thing from the DM's perspective is, like, if you have easy encounters that you can feel really good about them, the player characters and the players, high-fiving because their characters are kicking in the teeth of bad guys. You're like, yeah, because that's what that encounter's there for. It's there for them to maybe use some resources, but not a lot, and feel really good about a combat. Like, that's why it's there. Like, I want to give high fives to, like, great job, guys. You guys did it. You were awesome. You really wrecked this thing. Great job. Knowing in the back of my head, hey, that sledgehammer, that boogeyman's around here somewhere. He's gonna get you. He's gonna get you at some point. Like, having that in the back is always really fun. Like, it's only kind of a matter of time. Like, they're gonna find you. And even if you constructed some way for them to avoid that sledgehammer encounter, that they did the optimal path. They took the optimal path to get to the BBAG as fast as possible with the least amount of stuff. They alpha strike. They used all their abilities on the bad guy. They grabbed the loot and they ran right back out the dungeon, never dealing with a sledgehammer encounter. Like, that lieutenant's still in the world. He's still there. Like, they can still find them, right? They could still pose a problem. Like, even if it was like, we stopped the dark ritual and we went back to town and everybody threw us a feast and everything was great, and then we go on to our next adventure, and then we get back from our next adventure and it'd be like, what do you mean the dark ritual was completed? What are you talking about? It's like, oh, well, you didn't clear out the dungeon. There was still, like, another powerful bad guy, like vice captain cultist or whatever. Like, they just did the ritual while you were off doing whatever you were doing. And they're like, oh no, now there's a totally different problem. Now we gotta go deal with that. Right? So that's a lot of fun to sort of add in there. And so the last thing I kind of want to talk about at the veteran level is monster motivation. Put yourself in that cliche actor thing and it's like, but what is my character's motivation for this scene? That sort of idea. So that's kind of what we're looking for. So what, in any sort of specifically combat encounter, what are the monsters trying to do? What are they trying to accomplish? And the hint is that it's probably not kill the PCs. It's almost never actually kill the PCs. Let's go back to our old bugbear example. So in the bugbear example, we had the player characters are rushing into a goblin stronghold. They're protecting their home. They don't care about killing the PCs. They just don't want them here, right? They're home invaders, right? They're trying to get them out of here and trying to figure out how they got in and stop that from happening again, right? That's their motivation. And so that could be fighting. That could be bribing them to have the adventurers go away, right? There are a lot of tactics they can take to just sort of figure out what their goal is that they're trying to accomplish and why they're trying to accomplish it. Well, I don't want a home invader because it's my home and it's my safe space, so, I don't want murder hobo psychopaths rolling in at any time and just killing me and my family and my friends in our sleep, right? That's horrific and terrifying. So, you don't want that, right? So, they have a pretty clear motivation. We want them out of here by any means necessary. Which can include killing them, right? That is part of it too. But not necessarily the only thing that you can do. And then let me let me think about, let me pull in the example from the game that I played in last night. So like I said, it's a necromancer encounter. This necromancer is actually the sister of one of the player characters, and has this sort of, the DM uses this sort of like intro monologue conversation right before the encounter starts. The start of the encounter is kind of weird. It was kind of weird because we were like, are we fighting? Are we not fighting? I'm not really sure what we want to do. There was kind of a little miscommunication, I think, between the players and the DM, that we were like, what exactly is happening here? But there is a fight, and it was like, and the big bad necromancer was like, I want my sister to come with us and we'll all be together again, right? Just like we were when we were young. But, like, so that's the monster motivation. Told us up front, but the DM didn't sort of act on that. Whereas I was thinking of, there's a portal behind the necromancer that goes to, well, we know it goes to the Feywild now, but we didn't know where it went during the fight. The sister in question is up next to the necromancer, up next to the portal, and I kept thinking, why doesn't the necromancer just push her through the portal and just take her with her, right? She wants the sister. She doesn't really want this fight. She doesn't care. She literally says in that sort of encounter that she doesn't care about the rest of the group. So I'm like, why don't you just take the sister? Right, that should be the motivation, and then it should be us like chasing through the portal into the Feywild to like chase after her and try to grab her and pull her back, right? That's a much more dynamic, fun encounter, and being like, I don't know, do we jump through this portal that we have no idea where it goes and what it's doing, or do we like leave one of our party members behind? Like that's a very cool story in universe choice, but we didn't get that, right? And I kept expecting that to happen for like 2 or 3 rounds, and I was like, it just didn't ever materialize. Now I realize that, Necromancer is not exactly known for strength. Their ability to grab and drag a character through a portal is limited, but also had some undead with them who probably might have a better strength score. At least together could at least help to sort of like pull her through the portal, and then it'd be even more dramatic if the portal stopped working and we had to figure out how to turn the portal back on to chase after them, and maybe there's a little chase scene or something like that. It'd be kind of fun. They moved to like this very winter unseelie court Feywild thing where there's a bunch of snow, so it'd be really cool. It'd be like we run through and there's blood droplets and disappearing footprints in the snow because it's heavily snowing, and be like, oh, we're on the time, we have to hurry, because if we don't hurry, we're going to lose the trail, and we're not going to be able to find our player character. And yeah, I'll say that like that monster, having a very clear monster motivation and having that monster motivation not be kill PCs is really can throw the dynamics of an encounter in a very weird and strange and different way. So it's something to consider, like, what do the monsters want? If this is going to be a combat, what are they trying to achieve? One of my favorite sort of encounters, like, I know this will be potentially familiar for some people, is that I'll give a concrete example, and, well, I'll give a hypothetical example and then a concrete example. So a hypothetical example would be like, let's say that the party's taking a rest, they're on the road, whatever, they're traveling, and somebody's at watch, and they fail maybe they pass their check, it doesn't really matter, and it's a goblin encounter. We'll just go back to the old standard goblin encounter. And so these goblins attack, these characters while they're taking their long rest overnight. Okay, why are the goblins attacking? Why are they just accosting a random camp of adventurers? Right, the answer probably shouldn't be to kill the PCs. Right, that doesn't really make sense. So they were just looking for people to kill? That's like the Purge level weirdness, right? Or what's that horror movie? It's not The Guess. It's where like the group of like teenagers with masks break into like a family's home and like chase them down. I don't remember the name of that movie, but something like that. Like that's a weird setup for just random goblins for kind of a random overnight encounter. Or is it more likely that they're trying to steal their gear? They want to take their food, they want to take their weapons, they want to take their gold, right? And that really changes the dynamic of an encounter. If you have, let's say you have right, your fighter or paladin, they go down to sleep, right? That right can't sleep in your heavy armor, right? Because it gives you exhaustion. So they take their heavy armor off, and these goblins rock up, and they're like, "Oh, well, we know that plate armor is very expensive," and so you have two goblins grab their sort of like breastplate and like run off of it, very sort of like Keystone Cops kind of style. And now this encounter is really about like making sure the goblins don't take your stuff, rather and maybe you kill the goblins, but maybe you're just trying to take the stuff from them, and their goal for the encounter is like to grab stuff and get away into the darkness. Right? Very different encounter, a much more dynamic, more in a lot of ways silly, fun encounter than just like, oh, there's a half a dozen goblins and they attack you in the night and the person on watch sees them and alerts everybody and everybody gets up and they fight the goblins and then we go back to our extended rest. But instead be like, oh, they're trying to take stuff. Maybe they grab something and they don't realize it. Right? Goblins are intelligent, but they're not that smart. Maybe they're just grabbing stuff at random, and they end up grabbing the group's bag of holding. They're gonna take like most of their stuff, most of their actual items, and run off into the night. Right? Totally different encounter, total different feel and energy to it. So definitely think about those monster motivations because it's really gonna tell you a lot. Even like I said with the going back to the construct encounter I talked about was sort of like the non-death resolutions. Like we were already using that, being like the monster motivation for these constructs is to neutralize the threat. Right? It's not to kill player characters. That's not part of their programming. They don't care about that. They just know that there's somebody here that's not supposed to be here and they're moving around, and they don't care if that person leaves. They don't care if that person is knocked out. They don't care if that person dies. They just know that there's a threat here and it needs to be neutralized and it needs to be removed from this area, either by it not existing anymore or it literally leaving the physical space. Right? Which can be a very different, and it can be fun to sort of play constructs in that way. Be like, instead of attacking, they're like actively pushing characters, like doing shove attacks on characters back towards the entrance, trying to push them away. As more sort of like alarm bells, klaxons go off and more kind of show up, and they're just sort of like Modron kind of style, just like pushing them back towards the doorway of the dungeon. That could be very fun. So just kind of having these different ideas. Another good one, I think, we can use the ghouls. And let's not use ghouls, even though the ghouls would work the same. A lot of monstrosities or beasts or things like that are generally food motivated. If they're seeing the party, some sort of prey, right? And so if you have, let me think of a good nasty for this. What's a good nasty? Let's use an owlbear. Owlbear is a classic D&D example. So let's say an owlbear, and there's an encounter. You move into an owlbear's nest. Maybe there's multiple owlbears for this example. So everybody's kind of involved with different creatures. Let's do like everybody's kind of one-on-one pairs, even though that would be weird for an owlbear encounter to have 4 owlbears. But let's just go with it. And then that one owlbear knocks down whoever it is. Let's say the rogue. KOs the rogue and knocks him to 0, and they tip over. And then the owlbear, right, predator, food motivated, grabs the rogue in their beak and starts dragging them out of the arena, dragging them deeper and deeper into this cave system, back to their like little nest to go munch on the rogue. And then the encounter kind of shifts between being like, oh, we're going to attack these guys back and forth until, one of us hits 0. And instead it's about like, oh, I have to stop what I'm doing because this thing is actively dragging away one of my unconscious party members. And if they lose line of sight, who knows what's going to happen to that character, right? I mean, we can intuit that it's probably just going to eat that character and that character is going to perma die, right? But having a clear motivation for the monsters is really, really important, right? it really can make the same encounter feel very differently, right? That's a very different feel between this monster that's dragging off an unconscious party member to eat them, or an NPC off to eat them, versus like we're just gonna sit here and slap each other until one of us hits 0 hit points, right? Very different feel. But that's it for sort of this apprentice level and veteran level. I've gone a while. This ended up being a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, which is fine. But I think we're going to pick up with this probably next time. So I think I'm going to actually probably skip our next solo RPG session so I can finish off this list, because I'm only about halfway through the notes, right? Again, most of it was the apprentice level, but I do think that with the Master Paragon and God tier level, those next 3 levels will be themselves good enough for an entire stream to kind of talk about. So, of course, if you guys have any questions about this stuff, make sure you drop that stuff in the comments. Other things to talk about, let's see, there's the blog, reddragonfiend.com, there's DriveThruRPG stuff. If you want to check out some pay what you want downloads there is, make sure to follow and subscribe and all that good stuff. If you're really interested to having learning a lot more about this stuff, and if this information is really useful for you, please make sure to share it online. That's the easiest way to get in front of other eyeballs. So whether that's Reddit or social media or your preferred RPG forum like Ian World or whatever, feel free to share it. Please do. If you have any very specific questions or ideas for future content you kind of want to see covered, make sure to drop those in the comments and I'll take a look at it. And if there's enough interest, like I said, if we have enough interest about like me going through the chapters of the DMG and coming and fixing it, or coming up with better alternatives for you to use as a dungeon master, I can certainly do that. That would itself be a fun stream, or probably a few streams. But this is always fun. I love talking about this sort of like DM craft kind of stuff. Like tons and tons of fun. But that's going to be it for me for this time, and then I'll see you next time, and in that time we'll talk about these next 3 levels and clear that up. I think that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you guys next time, alright? Bye-bye.